Welcome to Headlines, everyone. I'm Anita Sharma. We are focusing right now on South Korea, with President Yoon Suk-yeol declaring martial law while Parliament moves to block it. Yoon said the decision to enforce martial law was made to remove pro-North Korea forces from the country and to try to protect the liberal constitutional order. While the military entered Parliament, hundreds gathered in front of the assembly, standing against the martial law. The members of Parliament from both the majority and opposition voted to block the law, which, if enacted, essentially would have suspended all parliamentary activity. These moves follow Yoon's People Power Party and the Democratic Party continuing to disagree over next year's budget bill. Here is what South Korea's president had to say in an unannounced televised address declaring the martial law.
I declare martial law to protect the Free Republic of Korea from the threat of North Korean communist forces, to eradicate the despicable pro-North Korean anti-state forces that are plundering the freedom and happiness of our people, and to protect the free constitutional order. Through this martial law, I will rebuild and protect the Free Republic of Korea, which is falling into the abyss of national ruin. To this end, I will definitely eradicate the anti-state forces who are the main culprit of the country's ruination and conduct vicious activities.
Joining me now to discuss these developments further is our very own Orkan Amashov and Anastasia Lavrina. Good day to you both.
Okay.
Orkan, let's start with you and your reaction to these latest developments in South Korea.
Extraordinary development. Today we've been covering different areas of the world, different parts of the globe. We talked about Angola earlier and Syria, and again now South Korea. It's extraordinary what happened there from the perspective of the constitutional structure, the paralysis of the government, president being unable to ensure that the laws are pieces of legislation are being enacted in the parliament, and parliament actually cumulatively as a whole body fighting against the president. This is an extraordinary process. I mean, martial law is perfectly legitimate course of action. It's constitutional. Actually, according to the Constitution of South Korea, it is one of those prerogatives that president has. But the point there is that president is entitled to declare emergency or martial law, but this is subject to subsequent approval by the parliament. So what happened there is that president, after the realization of this governmental paralysis, decided to declare martial law, and then all of these developments took place, and there was a martial law put into practice for a couple of hours, and then parliament convened. Wow. I think 190 lawmakers out of 300 managed to get into the parliament. And we know that some of those parliamentarians were using extraordinary ways to get into parliament because the military was blocking the entrance to the legislative body. And they convened and also they adopted this motion in line with which this martial law should be lifted. So that's the current constitutional position. President declared martial law, Parliament voted against it, and now President has to lift the martial law according to the Constitution of South Korea. Certain reports were trying to get in touch with the Defense Ministry, and the Defense Ministry is saying that the martial law is still in place. They will lift it if President says so. So effectively, it is a very interesting situation. It's a development, and it's unfolding still, and we will see the way the president will react to it. Because quite clearly, when we first heard about this news a few hours ago, we were discussing it, you, Anastasia, and myself, and some other colleagues. For us, it did seem to be an internal development, driven by internal frictions. President is unable to govern the country, and let me make it this point absolutely clear. The president of South Korea is a proper head of state with real powers. He's not ceremonial figurehead. But the point about their system is that the parliament is being comprised of MPs who have practically nothing to do with the president, because parliamentary elections is a separate process and the president is elected by other means. So we don't have this parliamentary system where the party which does command the majority, the confidence in the parliament forms the government. It's not a parliamentary system. It's presumably, we could classify it as a semi-presidential system. So that's the root cause of the paralysis. And we'll see the way things will unfold. It's quite fascinating to observe, by the way.
Yeah, it is. You know, the term unprecedented gets bandied about quite frequently, but I think it's fair to say, right, Anastasia, that in this case it certainly is unprecedented, and quite bizarre. Now, I understand you've been garnering, Anastasia, some international community reaction. What are you finding out thus far?
Right, that's quite interesting, as we cannot find so much reaction on the international globe. As my colleague already mentioned, we learned about these processes just some hours ago, and the world is expecting what will be next. Of course, this law is a constitutional law, and the president, he has this power. But the problem is that already the people of this country and some other forces are trying to find different reasons on why president decided to have this law right now. It's quite interesting because he could have it before, but now, and he has this announcement at night, almost at 11, if I'm not mistaken, the time in South Korea. Why he didn't wait until the morning, for example? Why he did it right now? That's a very good question. And some people already saying that the move comes after 2 years the president was struggling to push his agenda through an opposition-controlled parliament. So they do compare these processes with the domestic issues, saying that there is no any relations with what's happening when the president is speaking about defending the country's constitutional order, about the threat which is coming from North Korea. Some powers are trying to bring an issue of the domestic disagreements between the parliament, between the opposition, and between the president himself, remembering some other previous stories which happened with his family, let's say with his wife. We already heard about that. And it's very interesting that already there was some reaction on behalf of the United States of America. Of course, they are quite worried about, as there is communications and strategic partnership between South Korea and the United States. They do have many projects together when it comes to security, of course, also. So they do worry about the processes taking place in the South Korea at the moment, and they keen to see the peaceful resolution of what is happening. But the people on the street, I watched some reports, I watched some products made by BBC, CNN, and other channels, and they are saying that the people are so much concerned. What does this mean for democracy in the South Korea? How North Korea may react on that, because they were so accusation of North Korea's movements inside the countries, where we should be worried on how North Korea will react on that as well after some period of time. People on the streets, they don't know what to expect from the future, how the government will react, whether they agree to forget to abstain from this law tomorrow morning, maybe, probably, what will be the reaction of the president. And if it stays like this, what to expect from the movements, from the forces, from the police? How do they are ready to bring more forces on the street of the South Korea?
Yeah, good analysis from both of you. And speaking of reaction from people on the street, we have gathered some reaction. Let's take you to New York City right now, where folks who are originally from South Korea are expressing their, I'll say, surprise and discontentment, if you will, with what's happening in South Korea right now. Take a listen.
I'm actually born from America, and my parents are Korean. So a lot of my friends are actually from Korea. And just hearing about what just happened, it's just like, at first it's unbelievable that happened. Because just with the politics in Korea, it's just so chaotic.
I saw the news this morning. It was pretty shocking. South Korea had been a solidly democratic place for decades now. And, we all know the history of South Korea, that in the, let's say, 60s through 70s, there were some authoritarian rule there. And it's unfortunate that it seems to be taking a step backwards to that. And as I said, very shocking, given, what had happened over the last couple of decades. But yeah, that seems to be a real threat to democracy and rule of law there in Korea. And as a Korean American, as someone who was born there, that's certainly an issue of great concern to me.
I think a lot of the other party members in the National Assembly was against what he wanted to do, which is why he wanted to show power and declare martial law. And that's the reason why he declared it. And then now we have to see whether or not democracy is actually safe or not in Korea.
There you have it. Very interesting turn of events and reaction from folks who are from South Korea, living, of course, now in the U.S., as we just heard. One gentleman there had said this is a very trying time for the country because, as he said, under the 60s and 70s, they were dealing with an authoritarian rule, but they've enjoyed many decades where South Korea has undeniably become a force to be reckoned with and, quite frankly, respected by nations around the world.
Yeah, South Korea is a power to be reckoned with, of course.
Yeah.
South Koreans haven't had this sort of situation since early 1980s, actually, for the past 40 years. And for those youngsters, this is a completely new type of development, and they're not familiar with this sort of situation. Martial law, this application of force, the parliament being disbanded or dissolved. Actually, talking about dissolution of parliament, according to the constitution of South Korea, president is not allowed to dissolve National Assembly under any circumstances.
Okay.
What he can do, actually, he can declare martial law, which is subject to the subsequent parliamentary National Assembly approval.
Which he didn't get.
Which he didn't get at this juncture. That's why we have this problem with the Constitution, slight problem with the Constitution, and this sort of a very interregnum style situation that we are observing currently, this interim situation. But he cannot dissolve the National Assembly under any circumstances. For that reason, even if under martial law Parliament is inactive, or any sort of gathering is banned, still that composition of the National Assembly must remain. I will come to a point that you mentioned. I know what you're driving at about the external influence, of course. What is very interesting about the developments here is that initially, when we looked at it, as I mentioned earlier, it did seem to have been driven by internal politics. President not being able to function properly, the machinery is not working.
Yeah, they're calling him a lame duck president,
there's one important
right?
massive but. President, in his address to the nation, which was a late night address, he said that we have to protect our constitutional order, our liberal order, and also protect ourselves against the danger emanating from North Korea. So his argument is that the machinery is not working, we are prone to external influences, and therefore danger may come from North Korea. The geopolitics come into the equation. Today we were discussing Angola, where geopolitics, the China-US confrontation was an incredibly important part and parcel of that story as well. We talked about Russia as well. We understand that the North Korean troops are heavily involved in Russia's war effort against Ukraine. And the question that legitimately could be asked is what will North Korea will get in return? It's not a conspiracy theory. We're dealing with a serious matter here, and we are effectively reflecting on what the president of North Korea has said. He said that they have to mobilize their forces and be united against an external danger. And that external danger is primarily North Korea. And North Korea is supported by Russia. And of course, and the question is that, bearing in mind this North Korean contribution to the Russia's war efforts in Ukraine, are there certain things that the North Korean government may legitimately expect in return? And whether those things that North Korean government may expect in return could actually be utilized against South Korea under these strenuous circumstances. So it seems to be driven by internal politics, and still, to me, on the basis of what is happening there, it's a paralysis of the government, because after that landslide parliamentary victory of the opposition back in April 2022, as Anastasia has rightly mentioned, President has been unable to pass any legislation, and his only ability is to veto certain bills. And this cumulatively leads to the paralysis. So, by the way, talking about martial law, it is a constitutional measure, and we recall 1980 Turkey. there was the emergency and the coup d'etat, there are certain circumstances when the democracy is not able to function properly, and in order to protect democracy, certain force should be applied, and certain law enforcement agencies under the command of president may take over in order to govern the country under those circumstances before it could be governed properly democratically. That is a philosophy of martial law. It is a doctrine of necessity. But on the basis of what opposition members are saying, and they have been quite vocal, 190 of them, they're saying that the president is a man of dubious credentials, dubious moral credentials, and effectively we also know that certain parliamentarians at the National Assembly were contemplating the possibility of actually impeaching government officials, and president was very much against it. So therefore, I do not view this as an emanation of external threat reaction theory, but more of an internal issue.
Yeah, we're talking about a president who has very low approval ratings, right? Due to various controversies that have ensued, not only himself, but his wife. Scandals as well, including an alleged stock manipulation, as well as his wife apparently and allegedly, I want to couch that and be very careful, accepting a luxury bag. Now, we know that Yoon, as you alluded to, Orkin, has had a rather tough time pushing his agendas in Parliament, which we also know is controlled by the opposition. Now, Yoon says the martial law was a move designed to protect the country from, quote unquote, like you said, communist forces in North Korea. And his decision comes at a time when the main opposition, the Democratic Party, has been trying to impeach government officials, which Yoon says effectively will paralyze the government and hence make them vulnerable, if you will, to North Korea. Is there anything that you would like to add to that, Anastasia, with respect to the back and forth here and the political machinations within this country in the parliament?
That's quite interesting, especially because I would like to add a couple of sentences to what I previously mentioned about the position of president when he was saying about the forces driven by North Korea and that country, because there is a fear, there is an importance to defend the country's constitutional order, to manage the security. But we shouldn't forget about the role of the United States again, as Washington South Korea's most important ally for Washington in the region, with around 30,000 troops stationed in the country to defend it from North Korea. And therefore, if the president is saying that there is a threat which is coming to the domestic policy on behalf of the North Korea, what exactly it means for the international community? Does it mean that for the future we should expect more active participation of the outside sources? Should we expect that the United States should be more active in the region here, there in the South Korea? Or if it's more about domestic issue, then how president is going to manage this? Yeah. How the people on the street is going to react on that. As we know that during this martial law in South Korea, any political activity is prohibited. The power of media is in the hands of the government. Therefore, they cannot do whatever they want. And looking from outside, we can state that this is exactly the domestic policy which is being promoted and sustained by the president of the country, where he tries to keep control over some issues. But as it was mentioned by my colleagues, South Korea is still being considered as a democracy, as a developed democracy in the region of Asia. Therefore, how exactly it's being coincide with the reaction of the president and the decision of him to have this martial law? Another important question, whether it's going to be temporary. How long this law, if not cancelled by the president, is going to be continued. It cannot continue indefinitely. There should be the special frames mentioned, and what exactly should be managed by, who is going to bring more forces on that, who is going to be control on that on the streets of the government of the country. That is the essential questions which is bringing people to the streets. It's not only about the decision made by the president, but it's about uncertainty. It's about the importance to have more information to be provided for the population, for the people. If there is more concrete issues to be said by president or any other governmental officials, then it can decrease the level of pressure and have more consistency among the population.
You know, off air, we were discussing just everything that's happening both within our region right now and around the world, and just how everything's been upended. And this, what Anastasia just reminded me of, Orkin, was a conversation that you and I had with respect to Georgia, where he had said, look, there's also protests in the street. Granted, as you also mentioned very brilliantly, the presidential role in Georgia is quite different from what we're seeing in South Korea. That stated, you had said, look, protests in Georgia really have to continue significantly for quite amount of time in order for the party there, the ruling party, to make any definitive decision which will affect the people of Georgia. To touch on Anastasia's point, what has to happen here, do you think? Of course, we're pulling out our crystal balls here, right?
Yes, indeed.
But what do you think needs to happen here, whereby, yes, we have protests in the street. What has to happen next in order for there to be some concrete action that's taken in South Korea?
Yeah, it's very, honestly, it's incredibly difficult to understand what's going on there, because it's a development, sorry for this language, but it's a fast-moving development. Yes. So a couple of scenarios could be considered in this regard. First of all, either the president will give in to pressure and eventually the martial law will be lifted. I think that is one course of action. And this is a constitutional course of action ultimately. And then he could be forced to resign, definitely, because this is a crisis in the constitutional system. You got parliament, which is completely dominated by people who are against the president. Yep. You got the president, who is completely unable to initiate any legislation with the prospect of being properly enacted, and the machinery of the constitutional structure of the South Korea is not functioning properly. Either president should give in, or there should be new elections and new parliament should be formed, of course. And tomorrow we will have an opportunity to discuss this issue with some experts of constitutional law specializing in South Korea in particular, in order to understand the couple of scenarios how things may develop at a later stage. But my feeling is that eventually the martial law will be suspended. This seems to be most realistic probability, bearing in mind that 190 lawmakers have already voted in favor of lifting this martial law, and bearing in mind the president is not very popular, evidently. Had he been popular, probably, it's a merely conjecture, let me be absolutely honest about it, the parliament would have been comprised of people favouring the presidential line. Of course, we need to dive deep into that structure in the first place and understand these nitty-gritty peculiarities of the South Korean constitutional structure, wherein president and parliament at loggerheads at present. But ultimately, I think it will be lifted in the fullness of time.
I'm interested in a further analysis from you, Orkin, and Anastasia, please feel free to pipe in if you'd like. Because today you and I have been talking first about the situation in Angola, right? And for people who don't know, we've been covering extensively U.S. President Biden being in Angola, meeting with the president there, discussing initiatives, economic cooperative initiatives to essentially bring these countries together and, in effect, maybe stop China in its tracks just a little bit if possible. We also touched on Russia's ability or perhaps inability to move forward in that particular area. We then subsequently discussed the situation in Syria. And we talked very specifically about how Bashar al-Assad, who in fact he could rely on to fight the rebel forces. And again, Russia came up there where, you know, with Russia being very, very preoccupied with the situation in Ukraine, it's going to be tough, right, for a country, for Assad to essentially lean on Russia, and hence his move closer and closer to Iran. Now I ask you, let's just say if in fact, some would say it's preposterous that this president has put on the table the fact that they are now vulnerable to North Korea. And you mentioned this off the top, and if you can, sir, I'd like you to further elaborate on what exactly North Korea could do in a situation like this, when you mentioned that North Korea is also busy with Russia with respect to Ukraine.
Yes, indeed. And also North Korea expects something in return from Russia in the case of unlikely escalation between North and South Korea. That is the one scenario that we could actually consider. It is important to appreciate to what extent this martial law, this paralysis could lead to South Korea's inability to defend itself against South Korea. And normally, normal practice mandates that even if the governmental machinery is not functioning, there are certain functions of the state that will be properly implemented in the case of emergency. So I cannot see that scenario that current paralysis of government could lead to any escalation between North and South Korea, leading to some kind of geopolitical frictions involving other dizzying array of other external actors, of course. But in the case of further escalation, what is kind of taking place there will emerge into something bigger. And perhaps that's the reason why we're here today in this studio discussing this matter, because had it been solely about the internal politics of South Korea, that would have not been a matter of that sort of interest to us.
Correct.
And we see the potentiality here. And the potentiality here is based on the three fundamental linchpins. First of all, paralysis leading to South Korea's inability to defend itself against North Korea. Secondly, North Korea utilizing this opportunity and capitalizing on it and starting a new phase of escalation, which to me seems to be absolutely unlikely scenario now, because government paralysis does not necessarily indicate that there are certain core functions of the state about its ability to defend itself, that they will be curtailed. I don't necessarily think that will happen at this stage. I am very much inclined to think that for the president of South Korea, this is an opportunity to use this probability about the North Korean danger in order to sort out his own internal problems, which have been underway for the past 2 years, since April 2022. And the third linchpin, which is necessary, is an external espousal coming from other countries, from Russia and others. And as we talk about Syria, Iraq, and other Middle Eastern countries, we always talk about the possibility of this getting bigger, growing, and becoming something regional and global. I think those scenarios could be contemplated, of course, but at this stage, I think it requires a bit of imagination to think in those terms. It cannot be based on realistic evaluation of what's going on there.
Okay, Anastasia, your thoughts?
What we see in Georgia, for example, there is a division among the population, despite the fact that majority is talking about pro-European course. At the same time, we cannot see, so let's say, unity in their approach. In a case with the South Korea, people are on the street, but still the mood is quite peaceful. What they do not understand the decision made by the president, why it's happening in their country. And the president is not, let's say, getting so much support from the people. Therefore, in my understanding, it's again more about the domestic issues and the intervention from outside, even on behalf of the North Korea, despite the fact that I do expect some reaction on behalf of them. It's not a reason to be actively involved in this issue, and it's not such a big deal. It's very important, but still not such a big deal for Russia or any other country to be actively involved in the future development of the processes until the time when, if there is any kind of escalation inside the South Korea. I also agree with the statement that most probably this martial law will be lifted by the president, as he's not so much popular among his population. He doesn't get enough support from the parliament, and his people is asking him to make sure that this martial law is lifted, is removed, is cancelled. And if the parliament already made a statement and accepted this reality, therefore he has nothing to do as to accept. So today at night he's making this statement. Tomorrow, if he leaves this, his popularity will be diminished a lot. Doesn't matter whether
Won't his popularity be diminished either way, though? I mean, this is a very, very bizarre situation.
It's a very bizarre situation,
Yes,
but I
indeed.
mean, he's a president, he's the head of state.
Yeah.
He's not elected by the parliament, he's elected by popular vote. So they must have a certain degree of popular support, I think. And bearing in mind that South Korea is a democratic country, we cannot think about any other probability about his legitimacy. So in that sense, I think it's a very incredibly bizarre situation, incredibly bizarre. And also, back to the president himself, what he said, apart from North Korea, he said that there are certain anti-state elements within South Korea connected with North Korea that we need to suppress and crush.
But he didn't provide any specific examples.
Yeah, it
and
is very,
specific examples on why this is so important at the moment. He didn't show anyone or anything to be proven why he's trying to do this.
So
it's just overall word statements. And by this law, he also is now able to have some arrests, to provide some punishments, and the people among the population is being considered as a violation of democracy. That's a big punishment for the president himself after this decision.
But the president would say in return that he was compelled to take this action in the face of external danger.
Does he have any facts?
But quite often the way it happens, I mean, under these circumstances, if president is under the impression, and quite often he's unable to reflect on all the piece of information that he's been given, quite often he may say that it was a matter of absolute supreme criticality and urgency to protect and guard the constitution and the state. That's what he would say under the circumstances. I mean, there are extraordinary circumstances involving this sort of state intervention to protect the national interest. It is invariably undemocratic to do so because you need to consult the parliament, but quite often there are certain moments when you have to, as a head of state, on the basis of the knowledge that you may or may not possess, in this case probably we are really in the realm of conjecture, we don't know to what extent we can trust him, but the reality is that is how it happens. Head of state, in order to protect the national interest, intervenes in this fashion. It always looks incredibly, incredibly undemocratic. It happened in many other countries. And then if he manages to convince the electorate at a later stage, he's being regarded as a hero. But if he fails and he's being forced to resign, he will be regarded as a villain.
An issue. If within the next couple of hours he can bring the real factors that you see these people are responsible for something that can violate the constitution or bring some threats for the national interest and security matters, then he can pursue the population that it was necessary and it was important. But as for now, 4 or 5 hours passed since he made this statement, and there is no proven facts.
Allow me to add, and it will go hand in hand with what you are saying. We're dealing with South Korea. It's not, with all due respect to all South American countries, of course, that part of the world. Over the past 40 years, they've been through a certain degree of development, and this element of coup d'etat type of change in order to protect constitution is not something that they would have favoured under the current circumstances. So it does look incredibly bizarre, and we have to acknowledge and reiterate that whatever we're saying here in the studio is based on a very limited amount of information that we managed to gather over the past few hours. It's I would like to use this word again, developing development, and therefore we have to continue to follow it.
Final words, Anastasia.
Well, we really have to wait some more hours. Now it's night in South Korea, and again, we couldn't notice any, let's say, the mood is quite peaceful again. There is no any violations of the law on the streets. People are out. Of course, they're screaming. They want to bring the power. But this is a peaceful process, and already Parliament made this decision. The next turn should be the statement made by the President or any other official sources to make the final decision. We really hope that there won't be any escalation on the streets. And I think we should expect more reaction on the international community. I don't think they will ignore what's happening there. At least they will say that they do expect the peaceful negotiations, the peaceful resolution of the matters in the South Korea, but there should be reaction on behalf of the North Korea, on behalf of Russia and any other European institutions. President Biden most probably will do some statements, will make the statements as already mentioned. South Korea is a close ally for the Washington, and how the situation is being developed Trump there is quite worried for the United States as well. So we have to wait some more time to make sure that we are right in with our analysis.
Absolutely, and to your point, while we wait for President Biden to make some more comments, it's also going to be interesting to hear if and when the U.S. President-elect Donald Trump weighs in. We know he's not a stranger.
I'm sure
to
he will
making
make a
off the cuff,
statement.
exactly, to making off the cuff comments. So let's stay tuned. But of course, this is breaking news coverage here on AnewZ, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in. Oregon, Anastasia, as always, great analysis and covering of the news and the events of the day. Once again, folks, South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol declaring martial law while the parliament moves to block it. Yoon said the decision to enforce the martial law was made to remove pro-North Korea forces from the country and to protect the liberal constitutional order. Let's see where it goes from here, but for now, we wish you a good day, a good evening wherever you are, and we will see you again shortly. Take care.